Neon Green Network begrüßt Aufdeckerjournalist und Ex-Chefredakteur von The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger.
Thank you, and what an honor to be here tonight and learn about Frida and to be here in this event in her honor. And when I listen to the stories about her, the thing that strikes me is that she was a rule breaker. And rule breakers really interest me, because when you live in exceptional times, you need people who break rules, because the people who lead conventional lives are not going to be the people who deliver solutions. And this has been especially true as an editor for the last 20 years, going through this extraordinary, most profound revolution in media, this great social transformation that the internet has brought, the biggest change since Gutenberg. And the most interesting journalists to me were often people who broke the rules. There was a very interesting Dutch journalist who I met a few years ago called Joris Luijendijk. And he was an anthropologist. He had just come back from being a war correspondent. And he'd gone to his editor and said, I would like to write a column about the electric car, because I think that's going to be the biggest challenge facing the species, because if China and India start using petrol cars, we're in deep trouble. His editor allowed him to do it, and he wrote his first column, which began explaining why he wanted to write this. And then he said, I know absolutely nothing about this subject. Now, that was breaking all the rules of journalism, because journalists pretend that they know about the subject. That's the point of journalism, that you pretend that you know more than the audience. And he said, I know nothing about this subject, but perhaps you can help me write this column, because there will be people out there who know more than I do. And let's start. And of course, the readers loved it. It was so refreshing to have a journalist who was honest. I say that in fairness to all my colleagues as journalists, but to have that new tone of voice that said, actually, you may know more than I do about this subject, and you can help me. And when I met him, I said, I love that story. What else do you know nothing about? And he said, well, I know nothing. I'm really interested in banking, but I know nothing about banking. So I said, you're hired. And he came to write a column about banking. And he said, I know nothing about banking, but it seems to me like a really interesting subject. And he wrote a most extraordinary column for The Guardian, because all these bankers talked to him. And it's just become a best-selling book in Holland. And I think of Glenn Greenwald, who was a journalist. He was a blogger. And he'd never been to journalism school, so he didn't know how to behave as a journalist. His newsroom was his kitchen in Rio de Janeiro, which he shared with 13 rescue dogs. And most journalists, when they write their stories, they send it, and then they go home, or they may even go to the pub, because their work is done. And Glenn didn't know that was how he was supposed to behave. So what he did was to send his story, and then he thought, now it's going to be really interesting, because my readers are going to start responding. And they may point out if I've made a mistake, or they may be able to add to this story. And so he would make a cup of tea, and he would come back and talk to his readers. And by the time we hired him on The Guardian, he had 1 million people who came with him, because that was his community. They trusted him. They had a different kind of relationship than most journalists do with their readers. Most journalists want to keep them out like that. And Glenn said, come on, you know more about this field. And as it happened, there was somebody called Edward Snowden out there, another rule breaker. And Edward Snowden said, well, actually, I know a lot more than you, and the rest is history. So we need rule breakers. And this story that I just want to tell today is about breaking all the rules of journalism. And it came from this question about whether, when we thought about climate change, whether journalism as we do it had failed. I'm not going to labor the effects of climate change. Everybody in this room will know that this is not just a story about the environment. This is a story about every aspect of our lives, and anything that we may care about is going to be changed by climate change. And that is a picture of a log fire. and it's got a misprint in it because it should actually say Christmas 2014. And I was sitting by my log fire, and I probably shouldn't have been burning carbon having just resigned as editor of The Guardian, but I had 5 months to go because we had a general election coming. And I sat there thinking, what will I regret? I've done this job for 20 years as well as I could. Pretty soon I'm not going to be an editor, and what could I have done better? And I thought, have I done well enough on the biggest story in the world, which is climate change? And I went back to the paper in January, and I got a team together, and they weren't just environmental correspondents, they were people who covered anything. And I said, look, we've got a few months left while I'm here. What do you think we could do that would really make people wake up to this story? It's not that we've covered it badly on The Guardian. We've had fabulous environmental coverage, but there's something that journalism isn't doing that is not making people wake up to this story. And we sat there, and we had a little decision tree, which I'll draw you like this, because it was actually a very complicated idea that we settled on. So were we going to report or campaign? Well, we decided we could do both, but if you're going to campaign, you have to have a target. Who would the target be? Well, the Paris talks were coming up, and somebody in the room, a wonderful journalist called Georges Monbiot, said, well, actually, the Paris talks are the only thing that's going to change anything. And I know exactly the form of words that we could put into the Paris talks, and that's the only thing that's going to matter. So I said, give me the form of words, George. And he wrote me the form of words, scientific assessments of the carbon contained in the existing fossil fuel reserve. I was asleep. You couldn't print that on a T-shirt. That was not a campaign. He might be right, by the way. He might be right that is the way that change will come, but that was not how we could do it. So that was out. We could go for the consumer. We could ask you all to take fewer flights. We've tried that in the past. That doesn't work. So we were probably going to go for the producers, possibly. But realistically, is Shell going to behave their behavior in the next few months, or BP? Probably not. What about the investors? The people who put their money into these companies? What about them? And then we got onto this whole question of divestment. And should you go directly for the city investors, or should you go for someone else? And that's how we ended up with this rather eccentric decision, and it's slightly unfair. But if the bad guys are not going to change their minds, what about going for the good guys? This is why it's a rather complicated campaign. You end up going for people who are actually rather nice, and you rather admire them. And the people we decided to go for were people who, in all other respects, are lovely. And they were Bill and Melinda Gates and their foundation, and the Wellcome Trust. Now, these are two bodies that go around the world solving health problems, and there's not much to be said bad against them. But they would not divest from fossil fuels. So at one point, on one hand, they were saying, which I think everyone accepts, that climate change is the greatest threat to health. And on the other hand, they were actually paying for the fossil fuel companies to behave in the way they did. And so that's why we called on these two medical foundations, who were really nice in all other ways, and we said, we're going to do that. Now, already we had broken all the rules of journalism, and when I went and talked to my American colleagues, they were horrified. They reached for the smelling salts, because this is absolutely not how journalism is done. I don't know about Austria. Maybe there's some Austrian journalists who are similarly fainting and saying, what are you about to do? You're about to campaign as a newspaper. You should just be reporting. But I had in this mind that journalism was just failing. All the research showed that most of the journalism that was being done, this is in America, was either misleading or missing altogether. So if you think that this is the biggest story in the world, this is the biggest challenge that is going to face our generation, you would expect, would you not, to find it on the front pages every day. I mean, why not? This is such a big story for ourselves and for our children. And yet what was happening was that the coverage was going down, and there was lots and lots of research that showed that the coverage that was there was misleading. In 1 year, there were only 3 stories on the front page of the best paper in America, the New York Times. So imagine what the rest of the American press was doing. This was a story that was missing 8 minutes in the entire of 2012 on the US Sunday shows discussing this story that was the biggest story in the world. And there's no doubt that journalism is just not getting to grips with the story, and we can all think of many reasons why. There are the people who own newspapers. It's a very ideological question. A lot of people still don't believe it. There's an economic crisis in the press. We've got smaller budgets. We can't afford the specialists who really know about the subject. Journalism works on clarity, and yet much of science is terribly nuanced and careful, and there seems to be a lot of ambiguity. Not about everything, about some things. Some people won't acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. Then you've got this impartiality and objectivity. The BBC is a wonderful organization, but it feels it has to be impartial and objective. He says this, she says that. Journalism prefers new things, but climate change, each day, the climate story is much as it was yesterday. So what is the new that journalism can get hold of? Journalism likes reporting on things that happened yesterday. It doesn't much like dealing with things that might happen in 10 years out. A man dies on the street, that's easy. We can do that. We can say that man died in the street. But various people say various things might happen in 10 years. That's harder for journalism to deal with. Fatigue. Maybe the public is as guilty of that. Maybe our readers are just bored of it. They have so many problems to think about in the world today. Maybe they've given up as well. Maybe it's a question nothing can be done. You keep telling me about climate change. I can't do anything about it. Would you stop telling me about it? Even when you get big disasters like hurricanes or floods, scientists are usually very careful about not attributing this specific thing to climate change. So even when you've got something which journalists might get excited about and said, this is due to climate change, the scientists won't come out. There's fear. There's psychologists now who are saying actually people can't cope with the fear of climate change and what it might mean. And you must tell positive stories, not negative stories. And finally, there's measurability. So in every newsroom today, next door to the news editor, there is somebody looking at a screen, measuring whether people are reading it or not. And it's very tempting to say, look, actually nobody's reading that one. They just don't want to read about climate change. Get it off the front page. And actually, let's not write about it next week because we know that our readers are not reading about it. So you can take your pick from any one of those, or you can take 3, or you can take 4, or you can take all of them. And you could say journalism as it is just isn't cutting it with climate change. And that is a disaster, in my view. And that's why we came up with this campaign called Keep It in the Ground. And the reason it matters to me is this. It comes down to the whole question of how society arranges itself and what role information plays in it. And there was this big debate in the 1920s between these two men in America. On the left, you had John Dewey, who said that actually the press is crucial here. If you imagine a decision like climate change and the kind of decisions that politicians are going to have to require of people and uncomfortable choices, if people have got no idea what you're talking about because the journalists are not covering it, that is a disaster for democracy. So you have to prepare people and give them the information. They will then choose better leaders and democracy will be better. Mr. Dewey. Mr. Lippmann, Walter Lippmann, comes along on the right and says, that's a sweet theory, it really is sweet. But actually, the press isn't up to that task because of the nature of the press and the way it's organized and who owns it. And it can't do the complexity that is required. So actually, we're going to have to appoint elites to do it for us. Big difference between the two. And of course, as a journalist, I have to be on the Dewey side of the argument and say that what we do is crucial. And if journalists are not covering this, you're setting up actually a kind of catastrophe in which you're going to have an underformed, uninformed public and the possibility of democratically arrived at solutions is going to be really difficult. Now, the first rule of journalism is to make things really, really simple. And I see that you've had Bill Mckibben here to speak. And Bill Mckibben is a wonderful journalist who now runs a campaigning organization called 350.org. And he wrote this wonderful piece in Rolling Stone in 2012, and I was lucky enough to meet Bill at the Right Livelihood Awards around about that same time, 2014. And this piece, which I urge you to read, has just got 3 facts in it, and they're really easy to remember. You don't even need to remember what the numbers are, just 3 numbers. First one is 2 degrees, and that is a very easy thing to remember, and it's widely agreed that we can't go above 2 degrees unless we're going to get into serious problems. Second number is this, which is the amount of fossil fuels that we can burn and still stay within 2 degrees. And the third number is the amount of fossil fuels that we actually have discovered and own. And the only thing that you have to remember is that the third number is much bigger than the second number. Okay, really simple. Even those of you who struggle with maths at school have got the point. That we have much more coal, gas, and oil than we can ever be allowed to use and still stay within 2 degrees. Marvelously simple. And during the course of this, I tested these numbers. We had the chief executive of Shell, Ben van Beurden, who came into The Guardian, and my first question to him is, do you agree with Bill Mckibben's numbers? And he said, yeah, okay. More, I can argue, but more or less. And so there is this. These are the stranded assets. These are things that can never be allowed to be used. And so we started our campaign. The first rule was we're going to have no polar bears, because they're a terrible cliche. And if you're going to wake people up and say, actually, we're going to be doing something in The Guardian which is going to shake you out of your complacency and make you realize that something terrible is going on, we're not going to make it all cuddly and sweet for you. Sorry. And we had this slick of oil that when you opened your app or your screen or your paper, the oil was actually physically running down the screen. So imagery was really important. We used beautiful photography, and we did a lot of reporting. We explained what we were going to do. We used a lot of video. And then we did this thing. Sometimes, I don't know if this happens in Austria, but in a lot of countries now, the advertisers take over the front page of the paper. Does that ever happen in Austria? Yes. Okay, you pick up your daily paper and it's an advert for an Audi. And you think, where's the news today? And you have to get past the advert for the Audi to get to the front page. So I thought, well, if the advertisers can do that, why can't we do that? And we got this fantastic image from Anthony Gormley, and we just wrapped the paper in this. So you couldn't actually get to the news. You could not miss the fact that we were doing something extraordinary about climate change. And we ran a big chunk from Naomi Klein's book about This Changes Everything. And that was the front page, and that was pages 2 and 3. And these artists like Anthony Gormley just came along and gave their work, because these great artists are similarly campaigned. We found nobody who was not willing to work for us and usually not charge us anything, because they were so behind this campaign. The next day, that was what the front page of The Guardian looked like, another startling image. And this was just sort of setting up for the readers in advance of the campaign what we'd be doing. And then we thought, well, we're not just going to campaign. What we can do is report. And so we did the so-called the carbon bombs that were waiting to explode. And we went out with photographers and videographers, and we did reporting from India, from China, from the Galilee Basin, from South America, on these wonderful companies. Schlumberger, lovely name, lovely company, and told these stories in order to set up the context for the campaign. That was the Galilee Basin in Australia. That was tar sands in Canada. That was the coal boom in China. And then we launched the campaign itself. And in our team, we had a couple of young people who weren't journalists at all, and they sat alongside the journalists, and sometimes there were sort of shocking moments when these campaigners would speak, and these journalists would look at them in astonishment at what they were suggesting. And yet they sort of came together in the end, and there we printed all of the dirtiest companies in the world and said, should you really be having your money in that? You might think about wanting to take your money out of that. And we started working with NGOs who'd done the work on who these the dirty 100 were. And again, we put them on the front page of The Guardian. We said, this is who they are. Are you comfortable having your money and your investment in these companies? We had a beginner's guide, so that the whole point was that if fatalism was the reason that you felt you couldn't read about this, look, I know it's a bad problem, but there's nothing I can do about it. Please make it stop. You could say, well, actually, there's something you can do. You may have a pension fund. You may be a part of a university or a church. Your company pension fund, where is that invested? There are things that you can do. So we made it very practical. Every campaigner has to have celebrities, so we had celebrities. We started getting hundreds of thousands of signatures, and we started, so we said, well, people was ringing in and said, well, what can we do? We said, well, why don't you write letters to the board of the Wellcome Trust and to the Gates Foundation? And hundreds and hundreds of readers wrote letters, and we printed them, or we put them up on the web. And they were terribly touching letters because they weren't written by journalists. Again, I don't mean any disrespect to my fellow journalists, but they were in the authentic voice of teachers and nurses and police people. And I mean, it was just readers of The Guardian and way beyond normal readers of The Guardian. And we then got Nobel Prize winners because these were medical and health charities, and asked them to get in touch. So we really broadened it. So we were now not just a newspaper saying this is what we, a newspaper, think you should be doing, because I think that's a bit sort of 20th century. This was saying, look, actually we have harnessed these voices who really believe this, and there's a very large number of people we think you should be listening to. And then one of the people in the room, one of the campaigners said, well, why don't we get these readers to make a video? We could do that. And the journalists looked at them oddly and thought, is that what we do? I thought we were journalists. And they just made this little film in which we just said, look, here's a script, record any line from this script, and what it's going to be is a letter to Bill Gates.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Bill.
Hello, Mr. Gates.
You know us.
But we know you.
You've done more for mankind
than most can ever dream of.
Touching countless lives.
Donating billions.
To make a real difference in the world.
But now, Bill,
We need you.
we need you.
We need you. We need you to lead us.
in another fight.
The fight against
Climate change.
It's the 21st century's biggest risk
To the Earth's poorest nations.
You said that, Bill.
We agree.
But the Gates Foundation
Invest in fossil fuel exploration.
In companies that continue to look for more coal, oil, and gas.
Fossil fuels we can't afford to burn.
Here's how you can help us, Bill.
Help us by no longer supporting these energy companies.
By divesting your interests in fossil fuels.
Withdraw this funding.
and the planet will profit.
keep leading the fight against climate change.
Keep protecting the earth.
And its people.
And Bill,
We're asking you,
We're asking you.
please,
Please.
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 Keep it in the ground.
keep it in the ground.
Now, until a couple of years ago, I don't think there's a newsroom on earth that would have thought of doing something like that, because that's just not what journalists do. That is breaking all the rules. If you went to Columbia Journalism School, even today, and showed that, I think you'd be marched off the premises and told that's not what journalism is. And yet it was something very powerful, and it was a changing idea of what a news organization is. It's not just anymore journalists standing on a platform telling you because you don't know what we know. That world is changing. You all have the power to communicate. And this is about acknowledging that we're in the middle of a revolution and we can do more together than we can if we just go on behaving as though we're a 19th century institution in which our only medium is words on paper. So it was fascinating seeing this interaction between people who came from an activist and campaigning background and journalists who could do fantastic reporting and so on and so forth. And we wanted to be very transparent about the whole lot. And we did 10 podcasts, so we had somebody just recording all our discussions. And again, some of the journalists to begin with said, well, we've just had an argument. Do we really want that to go out? Because we're arguing about what we should be doing. And I said, well, why not? In any normal organization, you would expect there to be an argument. The newspapers are not sort of monolithic organization in which everybody agrees with everybody else. So we did all that, and we allowed our opponents and the people on the other side of the argument to come in and talk to us. And one of those podcasts is a very long interview between me and the chief executive of Shell, who, to his credit, came into The Guardian, and we had a very long and interesting conversation. Whoops, that's exciting. I'm going to skip that because that sounds too noisy. And then we went out to the poets, and we got the poet laureate in Britain, and we asked her, can you get all the best poets to write a poem? And then we got all the best actors to come in and read the poem. So we were engaging the broader cultural sphere as well as the journalistic sphere. And then we went back, and again we started talking to the readers, and as they came back with questions about how they could do this, and as they were experimenting and saying, well, I'm getting this answer from my pension or my company or my church, we brought it back to the level. Every campaign has to have merchandise, so we had merchandise, we had teacups, rather disgusting teacups actually, with sort of, oil sliding down them. I've still got one. I can't really face drinking my coffee out of it in the morning, but nevertheless we had it, and this was the impact. So the first thing that happened was that we went out and said to all the newspapers we could think of, by the way, take any of our material. We've paid for it. We've paid for it once, and we got fantastic messages from the people who were arranging Paris and saying Paris can't happen in a vacuum in which nobody is talking about it. It's vital that people start talking about it and reading about it. Otherwise, there's going to be no pressure on the leaders. The John Dewey argument. You need to be able to put the pressure on the leaders for this to happen. So everything we were doing was being amplified as other readers then started taking some of the content. That was just the Guardian content. We were getting to very large audiences. And we had surprising endorsements. That was the Energy Secretary of the day. And then we had Ben van Beurden, of all people, coming out and saying how amazing this was. He's a human being after all. The second most surprising endorsement was the next one. So we spent the last 10 years of our lives making Prince Charles's life miserable. Sorry about that, Prince Charles, but he was writing all these private letters. I don't know if that story made it to Austria, and the so-called spider letters, in which he wrote private letters to the ministers. And the kind of thing that if you're going to have a king nowadays, they shouldn't do that. I mean, Austria used to have kings, didn't they? And even if you're going to have a king in waiting, they shouldn't be writing to politicians. So we FOI'd these letters, and Prince Charles didn't like that. And he fought for about 10 years to keep these. And when the letters came out, they were really boring. But nevertheless, you could understand Prince Charles not liking us very much. But he comes out and says, this is a fantastic campaign. So good old Prince Charles, I say. But the most amazing, and people say, well, did the campaign win? Well, I never thought actually that the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation would. But what was happening was that what started as a kind of moral question, is it a bit like tobacco, is it a bit like South Africa, actually got into the heart of the city, because the city had not been thinking about these stranded assets. And people started thinking, if these valuations are right and I've got all this money tied up here, what does that mean? And so the next bit was this man. So he's the governor of the Bank of England. He knows a thing or two about finance. He is at the heart of the establishment. And he suddenly goes out on TV a couple of months ago and uses the language of Bill Mckibben. Listen to him.
This is the challenge. Sitting here today, is it the biggest risk today? No, it's not. Is it the biggest risk in the future? One of the biggest risks in the future? Yes. And so the challenge is how, and the challenge is that if there's not action today or in the near future, that risk in the medium term goes up and up and up. And it requires sharper action, more abrupt action, and a bigger hit to the economy and obviously to financial stability.
There's been discussion about stranded assets, that particularly energy companies will never be able to use all the resources, fossil fuel resources that could be in the ground because of controls on carbon emissions. Do you agree that energy companies need to be reassessed in light of the stranded assets debate?
Well, I think I put it this way, and just to put some figures on this, depending on your carbon budget, which is an estimation, but a scientific estimation, so we just take those as given, really only about a fifth or a third of all the oil and gas and coal reserves that are proven today could be burned and still be consistent with a so-called 2-degree world, a world with manageable climate change. What's important is not what I think. What's important is that investors, banks, insurance companies, the general population has the information they need in order to invest accordingly, to take a view on this question.
The governor of the Bank of England has become Bill Mckibben. So how good is that? So that I think was what happened. At the start of this campaign, we also got the Guardian Media Group, which was about 800 million to divest. And people who had not thought about this very deeply suddenly began to think about it. And so I think we changed something quite substantial. That was a New Yorker campaign that says, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we create a lot of value for shareholders. It's quite good to end with a joke, isn't it? Why don't I stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
Wow, you people do really powerful stuff. Thank you so much. Moritz Berlin, that's his name on Twitter, mentioned the Panama Papers while you were speaking. Do we have a similar problem with reporting on that? Because it's a rather dry subject area. Yeah. There's lots of explaining to do. There's lots of economic background knowledge that we can't expect our viewers or readers to have. Do we need to start campaigning about that too?
We certainly do, and in many ways we don't know where the Panama Papers came from, but it was another whistleblower, and I think this is the way the world is going to go, that it's so easy to leak vast databases that if people are doing bad stuff, it will be revealed. But the interesting thing is, Edward Snowden could have published all his documents. He didn't. He said, I'm going to give it to newspapers, so newspapers can make a responsible choice and explain this. And the same thing happened with the Panama Papers, that the subject of tax, I know this because I tried to do this about 5 years ago on The Guardian. It's the most complex subject, deliberately so, because people are trying to hide money. And I know that the journalists on papers all the way around the world that worked on that took months and months and months. And I think The Guardian did a brilliant job in making what is very complex simple, and that, I've talked about what journalism hasn't done tonight, but I think journalism at its best in tackling really complex subjects and making them simple is a great thing.
But it died down rather quickly, don't you think? Because it's a massive story. We should also be enraged about this. And still,
Are you not?
I am very enraged.
Keep
but
your
it's
anger,
not in the news anymore.
Well, I mean, that's what news is. I mean, you can't. News has to be fresh, and you know, there's partly the problem with climate change. I think it's got a lasting impact. I mean, if I was very rich and wanted to hide some money, I think I would think twice today before putting it to the British Virgin Islands. You know, at the back of people's minds now, they must be thinking, am I going to get found out, and how embarrassing would that be?
At least they are scared. That's a good thing, right?
Well, you would hope so.